just relaxed and paid
You tell them, you tell them. Oh, gosh, Rudy. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Bob Hieronimus. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Cordner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington. There they go. Well, we're going to change topics now. Ah, yes. Our guest is Tim Beckley. And as a matter of fact, what we're going to be talking about tonight, is his other book called Psychic and UFO Revelations for the 21st Century. As a matter of fact, I had such a wonderful time with that book, I didn't even get a chance to finish it. It's a real, I enjoyed that one a great deal. Okay, so we're going to change topics. Can we move on to the book you just published a few days ago? It's called Psychic and UFO Revelations for the 21st Century. And freak weather, Earth changes, pole shifts, aliens, arrival, global conflict, epidemics, etc., 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 with our guest Timothy Green Beckley. Are you there with us, Timmy?
I am indeed, and I have to say, Bob, while I was putting this edition of the book together, I thought about you because back, I think it was in 1980, you took me on a tour to see the great mural that you had done in Johns Hopkins.
Oh, you saw? That's right. Now I remember it.
Yes, that's right. And there were some of those things that now correct me if I'm wrong, because the 1980 is going back a little bit far in time. In fact, we had dinner at the revolving restaurant, and we were attending the APRO convention, yes, if I remember correctly, because I got kicked out of the secret meeting that they had along with Gray Barker and Jim Mosley, who Carl Lorenzen, who was head of the group, did not like. But it's kind of funny because the presenter at the secret meeting was a lady by the name of I can't even Stella Lansing. And Stella Lansing claimed that she could go out at night. She was what I call a UFO repeater, and could go out at night with her camera, either still camera or 8mm camera, and take photographs of the sky. And when the photos were developed, there was a whole new world on there. Anyway, I had discovered Stella Lansing. She came up to me in New York and said she wanted to speak for Jim Mosley's group. So this was about 2 years before she gave the secret talk that we got told to leave from at the APRO meeting in 1980. We had already seen her story, and it's a very good presentation. In fact, on our YouTube channel, you can type in Stella Lansing in the search bar there. And it's a great, I think we picked that up from like Unsolved Mysteries or something along that line. But this book in particular has had several editions. We kind of keep updating it. Now, when the first one was published, I can't even remember the exact date, but it must have been in the 1970s. And then I know we had another, that was a saddle stitch book. Now, that was typed, on a regular manual or typewriter. And the saddle stitch means that you had a couple of staples in the middle of the book and then the printer folded it over, right? But it had a lot of the material. I had been collecting predictions and prophecies from a lot of the UFO channels and contactees. And so over the years, I kept updating the book and adding more prophecies and predictions in there. And now, instead of having a 64-page saddle stitch edition, I think the current edition is 8.5 by 11. It's packed with great photographs showing kind of the UFO contactee and channeling movement starting in the late 1940s up to the present time, and it's now like 265 large formatted pages. So you can see we've done a lot of research on the subject. Now, if you ask me, have all the prophecies and predictions come true? No. But one of the things that we have learned about prophecies and predictions, and you wrote on, didn't you have a newsletter years ago, Bob, on Nostradamus? Oh, yeah. I had bought a copy of that in the newsstand.
That's right. What
a memory, right?
Yeah.
I mean, who can remember this stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, I was working on several theories on lottery numbers, and
that's right. Yes.
It ate up decade almost of trying to work on this particular theory that I had.
Yes.
And of course, as you know, when you're working on a theory, a lot of other people want to talk to you about it, but unfortunately, they're not necessarily going to listen to you when you tell them. So anyway, go ahead.
Well, but that little, I don't think it was very long. It was like 8 pages or something like that. They stuck that up all in the newsstands right next to like the racing forums.
Yeah, that's
So
me.
yeah. Caught you out that one, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. Prophecies. Okay. So have all the prophecies come true? No. Now I am only a messenger. I don't claim to be the prophet. But one thing now, maybe a little bit of history for channeling and the contactee movement might be in order at this point.
Sure.
If you go back to the Bible, you might even say that Moses was a channel. He channeled the Lord, and the priest at the time had what they called the Urim and the Thummim. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was a kind of I think they looked like dice. I wasn't around then to tell you exactly, but they tossed these like dice, and it would ask it questions, and this would be how they communicated with God. He wasn't about to talk to every Tom, Dick, and Harry. I mean, so they threw this device, which might be. I think that's actually where the concept for dice came into. So when you're in Atlantic City, don't think that you're doing something, like negative or nasty. You're really doing what the priest did back thousands of years ago. Have a copy of your Nostradamus newsletter and a copy of the Urim and Thummim, and you're in business. Okay, then I put more stock into the Oracle of Delphi, who actually wasn't one person. She was a number of oracles, but most people think of the Oracle of Delphi as being a woman. Now, the generals and the military personnel came from all over the Mediterranean to converse with her, and she had a tripod type structure with a cauldron on top, from which she threw some special herbs into it, which created a vapor of some sort. Some people think it might have been a hallucinogen, but again, I don't know what she was into so much. But anyway, the people in the military would come and try to get her to reveal to them the future of warfare and battles and stuff like that. And those just among the common citizenry would actually walk for miles to get to see her. And I know because I took the trip. I went to Greece and I visited the temple where the oracle was, and it's a rocky road made up of cobblestones. It was a path that I guess they created, and you had to walk this path several miles until you got to see the oracle. And chances are, by the time you got to meet her, she was so high as a kite, she probably couldn't give you any answers anyway. But she actually didn't. She kind of talked in riddles. I mean, she was like some of the channels even today. She kind of talked in riddles, and she didn't answer the people specifically. She had to give her predictions to the priest, who interpreted the prophecies and predictions that she was giving, and she claimed to be in touch with the Zeus and all the other beings who lived inside Mount Olympus. There's another inner Earth, hollow Earth connection.
Yeah,
then
right.
More recently, you had John Dee, who was the big occultist from England, who was friends of the first Queen Elizabeth I, and he talked to angels by way of a secret coded language that he had devised, and a device that I can't remember what he called it offhand, but it was a circular device and it was coated, so you had like 3 layers of wheels on it with symbols and all, and that's how you talk to the angels. But he was very popular, and again he was courted by the higher ups in England and all to give him the prophecies from the angelic kingdom. Then, and more recently, you had in the around 1840, you had a fellow by the name of, I believe his name was John Oliver, and he channeled a book called A Dweller on Two Planets.
Oh boy.
Okay, now this is a huge volume, and actually, it was Shirley MacLaine who kind of revived the public's interest in this volume.
Really?
She apparently was in a bookstore in France going through the occult section, the metaphysical section, of course, what else? But this was, I think, early on in her interest in the subject. And a copy of this book, A Dweller on Two Planets, fell into her hands. And she read it from cover to cover, which is no easy task, I might add. In fact, we had one of our writers, Sean Castile, kind of clean up the wording in it, make it a little bit more popularized. So we have our own edition of this out. But John Oliver was a channel. Now, he was a young man who lived around Mount Shasta in Northern California. And apparently he was a ranch hand for his father. And every day he would go out and make sure that the cattle were properly herded and behind the fencing and so forth. They owned hundreds of acres there. And I guess while he was idly sitting on his saddle, he would channel messages from Philos, who was an ancient Tibetan. And they put all these channelings, I guess he wrote it down through automatic writing, and they put this in this lavish book of, I think, about 400 pages. And now, the amazing thing about this book, or at least I find about it, not only does it talk about ancient Tibet and Atlantis, Lemuria, and so forth, but he talked about UFOs. I mean, he didn't call them UFOs or flying saucers, but in the book there are depictions that he wrote while he was in, or drew while he was in a trance-like state, and it shows cigar-shaped craft submerging into the ocean, which look identical to the objects that George Adamski and other contactees photographed in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So I don't know how you can explain that, but the drawings are in the book. Then there was another volume. We have an edition out of it at 1,250 pages called Oahspe.
Oh boy!
Oahspe. You know, have you ever tried to read Oahspe?
Well, of course. That's rules and regulations.
I'm proud of our edition. It's the Raymond A. Palmer edition of Oahspe in 2 volumes, 1,250 pages, because Ray Palmer was the one that turned me on not only to the Shaver mystery, but he turned me on to Oahspe. And Oahspe was written on one of the earliest typewriters, like in 1860 or something, by a dentist in upstate New York. He would get up early one morning, even before the sun came out, light a couple of candles in his room, and type away on this early typewriter. And supposedly it was written at 100 words a minute, which on one of those typewriters, you would think that it would blow it up or something. I didn't even know how that's possible. But he came through with this massive book of channeled material talking about the universe and the early formation of the planet and the lost continent of Pan and all these other intriguing subjects. Now, Oahspe claims that the stars are painted on, and that it's really impossible to go into outer space, which is kind of coincides with a prediction that I got through some of these UFO contactees and channel. Okay, so we're up now to the late 1940s.
Let's stop. Can we stop there? We need to stop here. for another break here on 21st Century Radio, and we'll go back to 1940s because I was born in 1943, and I'm pretty excited about that kind of stuff, with our guest, Tim Beckley, on the YouTube by searching Mr. UFOs and Secret Files. Tune in to his weekly radio program, Exploring Bizarre, with Tim Swartz on Thursday evenings on KCOR Radio Online. And all these links are on the front page of 21st Century Radio. Eric Van Doniken. You spent time with Eric Van Doniken, didn't you?
I have, I've met him several times, and of course now he talks about a place in I think it's Ecuador, where they entered a cave and they have all these ancient gold tablets, and there's even some pottery that shows humans coexisting with dinosaurs. People say, of course now here there's a TV series loosely based upon his work. But when I first met him, when the first edition of that book was published in the 1960s, we were both young, handsome, and carefree, and he had a damn bestseller, which I didn't have at the time, nothing like that. And I saw him lecture a few times, and he was kind of ridiculed and poo-pooed for his ideas. But now over the years, it doesn't seem so offbeat or so fringe anymore.
That's for sure, because the people that were criticizing him, especially those in UFO research, have all changed their mind now.
Yeah,
but they were
passed on.
They were beaten. Yeah, right, or passed on. But they were beating him up something terrible. Because he did make some mistakes, but he admits some of those mistakes.
Well, sometimes Bob, you got to speculate in order to get at the truth. I mean, not everything is cut and dry. Certainly in this, these topics that we ponder and discuss. But getting back to the early channelers, channelers and contactees, it kind of all started in modern times in the late 1940s and early 1950s. There was a gentleman by the name of George Van Tassel, and he had worked for, I believe as an engineer for Howard Hughes. Yeah. And after retiring, or perhaps after the death of Howard Hughes, he moved to the desert. There are a lot of people, and maybe not you and I, but I've certainly been to the desert a few times, and there are people who just love living there. And I've even been to some spots in the Mojave Desert where people have to travel 40 miles to get tanks of water to haul into where they live. Whoa, and they live on roads that have no gravel, believe it or not. And the UPS truck will throw whatever they deliver, on the last foot of pavement. And people still, well, this was a few years ago, but I don't think that it's changed. Anyway, George Van Tassel and his wife moved to a spot outside of Joshua Tree and the town of Landers. I think Landers is the closest town. This is where he later built his Integratron or time machine device. But it was in the probably late 1940s, or just the first year or two of the 1950s. He was sleeping out in the desert because you get a little bit of a breeze at night, and he saw this object, this ball of fire, come towards him, and apparently it either landed not far from where he was, or perhaps hovered just a foot or two above the desert floor. A doorway opened, a hatchway opened, and he heard a voice coming from inside the ship. And the voice said he was Solganda, who was a being from another planet. And they had a very brief conversation at the time. I don't know as if George went inside the ship or not. But after that, I guess he had a number of other UFO sightings, and people say, well, why did the UFOs land to him in particular? Well, one of the things that I've found out, and it's not an exclusive certainly, that a lot of these UFO contacts take place in areas of heavy mineral deposits.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly crystals, like in Brown Mountain, North Carolina, where I've been, where they see this mysterious lights coming up out of the crevices, again out of the mountains itself. In fact, there was a gentleman who lived there that I interviewed very many years ago by the name of Ralph Lale, who claimed that he was in touch with the beings who lived inside the mountains, who came from, I think, the planet Venus. Anyway, so George Van Tassel had these experiences, and they had a room under Giant Rock. Now, Giant Rock is the largest standing boulder in the United States, or at least it was at one point, because it's split in half after an earthquake. But the boulder stood like the equivalent of 7 stories tall and weighed millions of pounds. And underneath the rock, underneath Giant Rock, there was actually a natural room that had been carved out, I guess, by the way that it set in the sand there. And George used this as his headquarters, and he would go down there, let's say, once a week, and he would get transmissions from outer space. And the being that contacted him on a regular basis was Ashtar. Ashtar claiming to be at the helm of a fleet of spacecraft, some of which are up to 3 miles long, which hover above the Earth at the equator. Now, you would say that this sounds like a bit of folly and all, but there are numerous other channels and contactees around the world, not just here in the United States, who claim the same visionary contacts with this individual. Some say that he's a physical being. We have a gentleman who lives here in New York by the name of Mark Brinkerhoff, who's another one of these UFO repeaters who can take his camera, aim it out the window, and UFOs appear on it over Central Park. But Mark claims that he's actually met Ashtar in the physical flesh. Now, if you ask me what these beings look like, and I would answer you, I would say that most of them look like soap opera stars that you would see perfectly chiseled faces and features, and they look like normal humans, except maybe a little bit prettier than you and me, or certainly me. And they have been contacting humans, and Mark Brinkerhoff says that he's met Ashtar on a physical face-to-face basis, while some of the other beings talk, channels and contactees talk about meeting Ashtar or some of these other beings on astral trips or in the ethereal, in an ethereal form, and they're said to live in parallel universes and so forth. Now, maybe remember a couple of decades ago, there was an incident in England where one of the TV channels there went off the air, and a voice claiming to be Ashtar from another planet took over the station.
Yeah, I heard
For
about that.
a period of about 10 minutes or so, giving the same sort of messages that come through most of these UFO channels. Now, what you ask, well, maybe you haven't asked, but I'll ask it, then I'll answer it. what you ask is the message that comes through the most part. Well, it's a spiritual message. It's kind of very new age. Some of it, I would say, and I don't mean to insult anything, but I call it kind of fluff. It's more philosophy than anything else. Learn to live with nature. Nothing wrong with this. Learn to live with nature. Give up your hostility and more like activities to other human beings. It's a little bit of ecology, a little bit of health and healing sometimes. And it can be very positive. But then on the other hand, most of the predictions that are coming through these individuals, I would not consider very enlightening or very positive. Yet they say at the end of all these transmissions that we could change our ways and that there could be thousands of years of peace and harmony on the planet where we would get along with everyone, which I can't see as being possible, but get along with everybody, with animals and nature and the whole bit. So these were some of the messages that were coming through, along with the prophecies. The prophecies being of a end times nature.
I want to. I wanted
Go ahead.
to say something about George Van Tassel. I was so thrilled to read about him again because remember Chris Bird, Secret Life of Plants?
Oh, yes, of course.
He was a very dear friend of ours. And
Uh-huh.
we spent a lot of time in his home in Washington, D.C. And he's the one that introduced me in person to George Van Tassel. It was just extraordinary to meet this man. But I have to mention Chris Bird because he's very important in my life.
Well, of all the contactees. Now, Howard Menger, who lived out here in on the East Coast, he was one of the few East Coast contactees. He wasn't much of a I don't think he channeled, but well, he did get information. He was always big on building anti gravity devices. I remember I had organized a conference in San Diego, and Howard and his wife Connie were supposed to show up, I don't know, I think on Friday night or something, and there was no sign of them. Well, finally they showed up a day or so late, pulling behind their automobile in a small trailer was a flying saucer that he had devised. He was a tinkerer. He had his own shop behind his a place there in Highbridge, New Jersey, and he built these craft, some of which were based upon a technology that he claimed that he'd gotten from the space people. And one time he actually built the craft, and it flew up from his apple orchard and ended up like 60 miles away in Pennsylvania. And he got a visit from not the Men in Black, but from the FBI, who wanted to know what in the heck was he up to building this craft, and how did he manage to have it fly some 60 miles from his home.
Mm-hmm.
So now Howard also had a visit. He was doing a UFO conference, I think back around 1956, on his property, which was quite expansive, and had been promoted by Long John Nebel, who had promised to show up. And he had a mysterious visitor who supposedly was from inside the planet Venus. The visitor was known as Val Thor. Now, I don't know if you're probably familiar with the legend of Val Thor, but he is supposed to have been a man, human looking, again like one of these soap opera stars, who the late minister Dr. Frank Stranges claimed that he had actually met inside the Pentagon, and apparently Val Thor had no fingerprints because wherever he came from, there was no crime. He had a spacesuit, much like the material in Roswell, that you could not cut, damage, or burn, and he could read people's minds by mental telepathy. So there were all these very fringe type of individuals, the UFO channelers like Bob Short that lived out there in California as well, who claimed to have communicated with Horton, and contactees who claimed that they were going for rides on board UFOs and meeting these advanced extraterrestrials. And the space people were giving us prophecies and predictions. They were giving us prophecies about earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, about plagues and epidemics. And, people would say, well, how do you verify these accounts? And we did have kind of a way of verifying this. There was a gentleman in Canada who was a scientist and an engineer by the name of Wilbur Smith.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
Okay. He was the head of Project Magnet, an official Canadian venture where he actually built a I call it like a Radio Shack. It wasn't anything elaborate. I think the total investment of the Canadian government was like $10,000. But he put up an antenna, and they were trying to track UFOs coming in over Canada. But one thing he didn't tell the Canadian government, because they probably would have squashed his attempt to get grant money, was that he was a fan of these silent contactees and of the channelers. And what he would do is he would ask them a series of questions, and without them knowing what the other channelers were saying, he would compare the results so he could see if there was anything that all of them were saying together that would give it a little bit more credibility if 8 out of the 12 channelers were giving the same predictions and the same prophecies. So we kind of did that here too. I don't think I did it on quite as an elaborate basis of that, but we tried to keep track of the channelers and the information that was coming through to them to see if there was any collaboration among what they were saying, and we did find that a lot of the predictions were the same. Now, you can't listen to dates on this. I mean, you got to throw the dates out of the window. If somebody says, there's going to be a particular event and it's going to happen in 1982 or something like that, chances of it happening in 1982 are slim, and none. And of course, some of the prophets were more accurate than others. Before her death, and we mentioned this earlier in the show, Sherry Hansen-Stager was helping me with some material that she had collected on Edgar Cayce. Now, we know Edgar Cayce talked about the rising of Atlantis and the sinking of parts of California, but Sherry turned me onto the fact that Edgar Cayce was a UFO contactee. Which even his organization, the Association for Research and Enlightenment, for many years either denied or kept it pretty much to themselves.
Yes, let's pick up on that again when we return, because we need to take our final break here. Is that right? Our final break? Oh, geez, whiz. Okay, with our guest, Tim Beckley, on YouTube by searching Mr. UFOs and Secret Files.
Yeah, this is Iggy Marley saying love, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Irani. One love, y'all. Well, this is one of the most interesting interviews, Over the years I've been doing interviews, but this one is very special.
Every time we got together with Ziggy, we had something special. We had a wonderful time many times. Okay, our guest is Tim Beckley, and the books that we're talking about, the one that we're focused on right now, is called Psychic and UFO Revelations for the 21st Century, and we're talking about, he just mentioned Edgar Cayce, who is one of my favoriteest people on the whole planet, as well as 4 billion other people love him the same way.
Mm-hmm. And like I was saying, Sherry Hansen-Stager turned me on to the fact that he was a contactee, which I don't think many people realize. So I did a little research on it, and one of the statements he made, he said, "As we approach the golden age, the veil shall be removed, and the people of the earth shall become aware of the people of the universe." Mm-hmm. Now, he said that he was in contact with people from the system Arcturus, and that he had visited there numerous times in a dream state, because he felt that was the only way that we could travel the vast distances throughout the universe. And hey, I can't deny that. Although, what exactly is the dream state? Are we talking about out of body, astral projection, trips to perhaps a parallel dimensions? I can't tell you, but it is a kind of a stunning that Cayce was into UFOs without calling them that, and I guess we could put him in the classification of a UFO channel. And there are some people who say that his predictions are more accurate than some of the other predictions. Now, people say, well, what are some of the major predictions? Well, one of the things that the channelers and the contactees talked about is a possible liftoff of the planet. If things get really out of control and there's a nuclear war or some kind of disaster, perhaps like a pole shift, the space people will come down and land in mass and take away what they would consider to be select individuals to a safe harbor in space, and then I guess after a period of time, they would return them here. Now, people say, well, when is this going to take place? Well, no particular time. We don't know, but the mass landings and the mass contacts apparently they had started in the early 1950s. There was a case in Farmington, New Mexico, and this would have been after the supposed UFO crash at Roswell. There was an incident that took place at high noon where dozens of people out, it was during a lunch hour or shopping time, drive time, I believe on radio you would call it, right? And so dozens of people were on the street or out in their automobiles, and there was an entire fleet of UFOs over the town of Farmington. I don't know how many craft, but I believe that it was considered to be 50 or more. There were other incidents, of course, back in the 1950s where UFOs were seen over the nation's capital. They flew over the Capitol and the White House several times in July and August of 1952. The Air Force tried to explain them away as temperature inversions, but not only were they picked up on radar, but the pilots actually saw them, and they tried to chase them, and of course they would just vanish at almost supernatural speeds. But now there's a connection kind of to the channelers and contactees. We had mentioned earlier Wilbur Smith from Canada. Well, there was a fellow in a Navy admiral who lived in Washington, D.C., who had actually been a reader of like Ray Palmer's magazines and so forth. And he collected a lot of information on like Charles IV things that fell from the sky, mysterious anomalies, and so forth. And he claims that a UFO was shot at by one of the squadrons of Air Force planes, and a part of the craft actually fell in his back yard. Now, his name was Captain Alvin Moore. There isn't a great deal of it about him on the internet, but we've published some of his material in various books. Now, he claimed that he got a chunk of this material and was going to give it to Wilbur Smith for analysis because Smith had contacts in both the Canadian and the American government, and he put it in a safe in his office, which he claims that only he had the combination to, and lo and behold, the object or this part of a UFO that had been shot at by the U.S. military had vanished mysteriously. So I don't know if the men in black knew the combination or there were spying devices in his office or something like that. You wouldn't think that they would be advanced at that time, or perhaps Shaver's Zero came in and grabbed them. But there definitely was a connection to Wilbur Smith. So the predictions went on, and they still come through. We have a number of new channelers that are in the book. There's Diane Robbins, for example, who lives on the base of Mount Shasta. Now, Mount Shasta there in Northern California has always been a mysterious place. As I mentioned, Dweller on Two Planets was channeled near there by John Oliver. And people have had all kinds of mysterious things happen to them on or near Mount Shasta as they climb up the side of the mountain. There are people who claim that they actually met with the Count Saint Germain, this ascended master who lives forever. I had a friend of mine who worked for me for many, many years, Blue Ocean, who was a drummer. He did some session work with Pink Floyd, and he was a Native American Indian. He was raised there on Mount Shasta, and he claims that oftentimes the Indians would have rock throwing contests. I mean, throwing rocks at each other with a race of little people who seemed to be living in caverns on the side of the mountains there, and they could hear them moving through the brush and at night. they would sometimes give screams and howls. And of course, there have been sightings of Bigfoot up there,
Sure.
and other channelers as well. It seems that a number of people have moved there who have the ability or claim the ability to channel, including Diane Robbins, who has some material in the book, and she says that she actually channels beings from inside Mount Shasta, which would be a city that exists there. Now, I met a woman years ago who said she was actually from inside the Earth, who did some channeling. She said she was 250 years old. Her name was Sharula. She showed up unannounced at one of our UFO conferences and gave a lecture. She gave a very believable story, but then no one ever heard from her after that. But then we've had Venusians show up too, Dr. Bob, and we never heard from them later on either. So I don't know whether they went back to Venus.
I wanted to touch on one thing on Earth changes before we go, because time's running out.
Yes.
Many decades ago, there were groups of us that knew about the prophecies concerning the changes in San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we focused on, especially California, focusing on helping them and overcoming the situation. And during that particular process, a lot of important things happened, but in your book, you mentioned several things about San Francisco and Los Angeles and New York. What is the future of those possible three places?
Well, now we had a young lady here who lived in Harlem. I haven't seen her for years. I don't know whether she's deceased or not. Her name was Barbara Hudson. And she would go to I think it was St. John's the Divine. It slips my mind, but it's in the book. It had a beautiful cathedral, and she often had visions inside the cathedral, and the visions told about a giant tidal wave that would come over New York. And we've gotten messages about not so much earthquakes from the New York area, but a tidal wave in Manhattan being either partially or totally consumed by water. And of course, that's not as hard to swallow as perhaps other places, because Manhattan, as most people know, but certainly if you live here, is an island. Okay, so that was one of the predictions that was coming through. And California is, as far as I know, most of them were regarding earthquakes. And I think I don't know as if anybody predicted the collapse of the bridge out there, but there were other disasters that were pointed out that were due to take place. And when these signs and symbols actually did transpire, then apparently we knew that time would be running out. But it's hard to say whether this is we're talking about a period of years, decades, or centuries to come. And again, most of the messages that have come forth from these individuals do talk about how if we were only to sync up with nature and live in harmony with nature and with ourselves, that most of these things would not take place. They see the earth as a living entity. And I guess, of course, you've heard that before. I'm sure you've discussed discussed that on the air. So if we live in harmony with nature, Diane Tessman, in fact, who just wrote a book on time travel and the future of man, she believes that most of the UFO visitors are not from outer space, but are future men who are coming back to try to make sure that we don't annihilate ourselves, and to bring us up our consciousness forward. And she talks about these the things that we have to do. There's the rainforest and along the Amazon, where all the trees are being cut down. There's the slaughter of animals in a lot of places for no reason at all, and the misguided use of fossil fuel and coal instead of solar energy. So if we adapted some of these policies, perhaps some of this negativity would vanish from the aura of the planet, and we could learn to live a more peaceful, abundant existence. And boy, could we use to have a little bit of abundancy, I would say.
That's for sure. I don't know. Did you see the article from Bloomberg Business Week that Miami will soon be underwater and its drinking water will go first?
Oh, what?
So
No, I missed that one.
We'll send you.
I always wanted to move. I always wanted to move to Miami. I said, if I'm not in Manhattan, I should have moved down. I should have moved there. But when is this slated to happen?
Well, this is going to, a little bit over time. I'm just going to send you the article. But mainly it's going to take about 100 years for the whole thing to go. But my concern is drinking water. If they don't have drinking water, it's gone. It's over. And I'm afraid that Miami's in a bad situation as far as that. They have green water down there, as you well know.
Oof.
Okay. Well, anything else you want to say? We got about 30 seconds.
Well, I enjoyed this conversation immensely. And I guess go and get a free subscription at conspiracyjournal.com and hook up to our YouTube channel, Mr. UFO's Secret Files, and listen to me live on Thursday with the co-host Tim Schwartz, KCOR Radio, KCORradio.com. And Brother Bob?
Yes, sir.
Pleasure.
A real pleasure. We're going to have to do this again on other topics that you've done. Thank you very much for joining us. See you again, brother.